My name is Paul Stronsky, and I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment in the Russia and Eurasia program in Washington, D.C. And we are very pleased to welcome you all to our live virtual event, Corruption in Kyrgyzstan, The Path Forward. I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, where we have them from all around the world today, and for having this really, I think, timely discussion on corruption and politics and what it means for Kyrgyzstan moving forward. I'd like to also thank RFERL, which is our partner on this, as well as our live audience on YouTube for joining us. And please, you can pose your questions via the YouTube chat. Today, we're going to talk about corruption in Kyrgyzstan, the role it's played in the recent political and social turmoil in the country, and then the longer-term political trajectory of Kyrgyzstan coming from Sadyr Japarov's ascent to power. The social and political unrest we've seen in Kyrgyzstan and the collapse of the former government was driven in large part by recent investigations about the endemic corruption that is across Kyrgyz governing and economic system. All of which has eroded government capacity, undermined popular faith in institutions, and highlighted the lack of accountability of many governing elites. So we have some top-notch analysts, top-notch practitioners to talk about these issues. And let's just get right into it. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Shirin Akhmatova, who's a former member of the Kyrgyz parliament, and the leader of Umut 2020, a people's movement that focuses on anti-corruption investigations. We have Dr. Arsel Dolotkheldieva, who's an associate research fellow at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, and her research examines social mobilization, democratization, and institution building. She holds a PhD from the University of Exeter. We have Bruce Pannier, who's the senior Central Asian correspondent who writes for Kishlok Ovozli blog, and he works at the Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, based in Prague. Also based in Prague, we have Karl Schreck, who's the RFERL's enterprise editor. He's covered politics, crime, business, and sports in Russia and the former Soviet Union for over 20 years, including a decade based in Moscow. He's also one of the multiple authors of a recent very well received and timely study on corruption in Kyrgyzstan. So I'm going to just turn it over to Karl to talk a little bit about his work and his work of that team that he is representing. So Karl, please.
Thanks, Paul. So 1 year ago, last week, an assassin went into an outdoor cafe in Istanbul and shot dead a man who was sitting there drinking tea with his friends named Ayarken Saymaiti. He was a 37-year-old businessman born in China and had previously been a businessman in Kyrgyzstan. What the world didn't know at the time was that for months before Ayarken Saymaiti was shot dead, he had been feeding documents to a team of reporters from RFERL's Kyrgyz service, known as Radio Azatik, OCCRP, and the Kyrgyz news site Kloop. And these documents and the interviews he gave revealed that he had been moving hundreds of millions of dollars in opaque money out of the Kyrgyz financial system, wiring them to Europe, to the United Arab Emirates, all over the world, on behalf of a secretive cargo empire that operates across Central Asia and brings goods into and through Kyrgyzstan. 11 days after Saymaiti's murder, the expose by our group, our three organizations, was published, revealing that Mr. Saymaiti had been our source, and revealing the massive amounts of money that he was funneling out of Kyrgyzstan and their origins in corruption schemes that were enabled by high-level corruption in the Kyrgyz customs service. And I mean, it was a true bombshell investigation. What ensued were anti-corruption protests in Bishkek, and much of the grassroots anger was focused on a central figure in the corruption schemes that were revealed, and that is Rainbek Matreimov, who at the time that this was happening was the deputy customs chief in Kyrgyzstan. So the expose triggered protests, but over the course of the next year, under now former President Jeenbekov, Kyrgyz authorities took no action based on the evidence that was presented in the series of reports by RFERL's Kyrgyz service, OCCRP and Kloop. And I believe that a lack of action, I've been putting on my analyst hat, I believe that a lack of action by authorities in response to this expose, I believe it may have played a role in fueling the grassroots protests that eventually ended up ousting Jeenbekov last month. So basically, our three organizations and Bellingcat joined a reporting team earlier this year. We've been reporting numerous stories based on records that SIMIT gave us before his death, as well as other independent reporting that we've managed to do. But to this day, we don't know exactly what the state of the investigation into SIMIT's murder is in Turkey. But most recently, our reporting collective obtained leaked documents from the Turkish investigation. And this is a report we published on the one-year anniversary of SIMIT's murder in Istanbul. And what these records show is that early on, after Mr. SIMIT was shot dead, the Turkish police suggested to a reporter that he had been supposedly targeted by Syria-based militants because he was not a Muslim. And Turkish police have also highlighted that the suspects that they caught, that they spent time in Syrian militant camps in Syria. But this seemed like a very strange target, Mr. SIMIT. At least we had no indication in the records he provided our reporters with that he was involved in anything in Syria. But what these new leaked records show, and as we reported last week, is that the idea that he was shot because it wasn't a Muslim or was an infidel, that was merely a motive that was fed to him, at least according to his testimony, to the government's testimony. That was a motive that was fed to him by a Syria-based militant who promised him and an accomplice $100,000 to kill Mr. SIMIT. So what these documents clearly show, at least to the testimony therein, is that the person who shot Mr. SIMIT was merely acting as a contract killer. He had no idea who Mr. SIMIT was. But who may have ordered the killing and what leads the Turkish investigators have pursued to try and track down who was ultimately behind the murder, it's an absolute black box from the Turkish side. We've tried to get comments from them, and we really have no idea where their investigation is leading. The other thing that these leaked Turkish documents revealed was that SIMIT's widow told police that before his murder, he had told her that if anything happens to him, Raimbek Matreimov, the deputy customs chief named in our report, and Mr. SIMIT's employer, a cargo tycoon named Habibullah Abdulkadir, that they would be responsible. Now, obviously, this is just hearsay. Our reporters reached out to Mr. Matreimov, who issued a blanket denial saying he has nothing to do with Mr. SIMIT and nothing to do with his murder. Although, as our team's previous reporting showed, there were multiple financial links between the Matreimov family and Mr. SIMIT. So, we'll keep following developments in the investigation of Mr. SIMIT's murder, and one would hope that Turkish authorities might give some indication of where it's heading.
Thank you very much. And now maybe if we could, thank you for that. If we could move to Shirin to talk a little bit about, corruption from her perspective and in Kyrgyzstan and the work that she's doing. So Shirin Amatova, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you for giving me the chance to address colleagues and I'd like to talk a little bit about our own experience and practice of during this year-long campaign that in the end resulted in regime change. So this was the first time that we had a group of activists. It was a little partisan, and the movement itself was at first, I think most people didn't really believe that we would reach any kind of end results, but through the use of visual symbolism, through the use of new informational strategies in addressing the kind of the younger generation of Kyrgyz people, we were able to mobilize, the types of citizens who weren't usually interested in in questions of corruption. So the issue that I think led to this to the protests, it was in fact the when people felt like they were being denied any reaction from the government, and when the government itself refused to acknowledge what was going on, despite all the information in the media, it became the protests and the end results of the elections became kind of the last drop. So in a way, we can say that our campaign, the Umut 2020 campaign, which we started, it reached an end result. However, currently we have a very different situation than what we had envisaged, and when we attempted to bring kind of this discourse up in society at large. So we see that a small organization, a very kind of on the margins of the political circles, we were able to get more results than, let's say, when I was an MP for 5 years in Parliament, which is also something to think about in terms of what can generate better results in fighting corruption, whether it's something within political institutes, within kind of the establishment, or whether activists on the outside, on the margins of these political circles, can get better results. So I believe that in general, all of Central Asia has been kind of inundated in these companies and in these companies that are linked to the criminal syndicate of Abdulqadirs and Matraimovs, and this doesn't only concern Kyrgyzstan but also Central Asia at large. Would you like for me to continue?
Sure. If you have a few, or feel free to go on, or we can move on to SL if you have any other final thoughts.
Okay, I'll just wait till everyone speaks.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right, Asel, maybe if you could put this into a broader perspective now, help us put this into a broader perspective of what's going on in Kyrgyzstan.
Sure. So corruption is a very long and protracted phenomenon in Kyrgyzstan, and it's basically a result of failure of distorted economic liberalization and distorted political democratization. So corruption has been accompanying the post-independence development since early years, and what we have today, this large corruption scandals involving members of regime, involving their friends and cronies. This is no surprise for ordinary Kyrgyz citizens. This corruption scandal involving the customs service and their leaders on the top is not the first example of exit of large amounts of money from Kyrgyzstan. Let me just remind you, a similar case involved the son of the former president Maxim Bakiyev in 2010, and there was also another huge investigation carried out by a London-based organization called Global Witness, according to which Maxim Matraimov took out from the country hundreds of millions of dollars. And this case is still pending. The Kyrgyz authorities were never able to bring Maxim Bakiyev to justice, not mentioning that the authorities were not able to return the money. And different schemes were used to launder money or to take out the money from the country using different shell companies, offshore schemes, different banks, international banks, private banks. So in a sense that what I'm trying to say is that the case involving the scandal involving Raim Matraimov and the state authorities, state bodies is no surprise to anyone in Kyrgyzstan. So in that regard, I think how to say it added to the social explosion, which was long in the air, and their non-action from the part of the president added, of course, fuel to people's discontent. I'm currently, my team, we're currently gathering interviews with ordinary participants of the 5th October events. And what those interviews clearly show that a lot of ordinary citizens, young people who participated in the peaceful demonstration, which it started on the day, and then the storming of the White House, they all participated also in the protest organized by Umut movement, what just Shirin mentioned. So they were taking part in a 3 protests earlier that year. So in a way that their participation in the peaceful demonstration against the corrupt elections were, in a sense, probably prepared by this movement against corruption earlier that year in 2019. So corruption is, of course, a really an endemic feature of Kyrgyz politics, and kind of it's really not surprised that people really were unhappy with the president, with the current regime due to corruption. Right, and due to allegations against even the president, who would be allegedly involved into these schemes, if not personal, but at least covering those schemes. That's why people were so unhappy with the Jeenbekov's rule. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, got to put my unmute myself. Thank you very much, Asel. And I just want to encourage everybody who is watching on live stream. Feel free to send in your questions through the YouTube live chat as well, and we'll take as many questions as we can. Now, if we could turn to Bruce for some thoughts as well.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Carnegie, for hosting the event. Thank you, Mohammed. You know, I mean, taking a little bit. Backing up a little bit from what just happened. Corruption in Kyrgyzstan system, of course, as we've heard, is endemic. But I think the optics have gotten much clearer, much more in your face in recent years. 15 years ago was the first time that I would go out there and see that a lot of politicians had these guys that hung around with them. They call them sports mini, right? Because a lot of them are recruited in the gyms and stuff like that. But these guys that would hang around certain politicians. They were dressed in black coats and stuff. I mean, it's one thing to have a bodyguard, but it's another thing to have like a small group around you of guys that look like thugs, right? And so when you go to see politicians, even some of the most moderate politicians and the ones that seem to speak lucidly about politics, but still they were forced to have this group of 20 or 30 guys or possibly even more, that went with them everywhere they went. Everywhere they traveled. And you could see that this was a bad sign already developing in Kyrgyz politics. The Bakiyev era was kind of like the hallmark of many politicians. They all traveled with these groups of thugs, essentially. and so you could use them when there was pressure from the authorities or something. Obviously, these were the people that came out and protested, or led protests or something like that. They're very intimidating, so you could see that there was a shift in that. This is actually commonplace now. It was something that I noticed 15 years ago that really struck me. But now when you go out and see this is almost something you expect to see when any politician gets up on, most politicians get up on stage and be surrounded by these kind of guys, menacing looking figures that hang around. We saw it when Japarov, they were trying to hold the first meeting at the Dostik Hotel in Bishkek. You have all these guys outside, black coats, mean looks. And like I said, it's now a feature of Kyrgyzstan's politics. It's a bad feature, but it's like something you can actually see that gives you the idea of the relationship between organized crime and politicians in Kyrgyzstan. Now, with this recent change of power, at least in the old days, when Bakiyev was in, or Atambayev was in, or even Jeenbekov for that fact, or way back to Akayev, there was the leader, and you understood there was these patronage networks that existed that were involved with organized crime, right? But they weren't so much on the surface, right? There was the president, and you could never really see a direct connection between him and the organized crime groups, even though you suspected that, or maybe you knew somebody who was able to verify that yes, they have contacts. But it wasn't obvious to see this. Now with this group that's come in. I already said they had, the guys in the black coats, or wherever Tasheev goes, wherever, Japarov goes, wherever Mamitov goes. I mean, these are the kind of guys that are hanging around. But what's different about this government is that where the government seemed to be above the organized crime groups, now it's really blurred to me who's in charge of the country, because you detain someone like Raimbek Matraimov. And yet the new head of the security forces in Kyrgyzstan, Kamchibek Tasheev, says this is a good guy. He knows him personally, right? This is the head of security for the whole country. He knows this guy personally, and he says it. The guy who is prime minister and was acting president until just a few days ago, of course, Sadyr Japarov, met with him. He was detained but let go under house. This Raimbek Matraimov was detained, then let go under house arrest. He meets with the president. Now, what country can you think of where the leader, of the country holds a meeting with someone who's suspected to be one of the big mob bosses, one of the biggest factors in organized crime in the country? And he says, Japarov comes out and says, we talked for a while, and he told me there was no use in arresting him, because then you wouldn't get all the money back and stuff. So it looks bad. You have the head of the country cutting deals with a guy who's suspected to be an organized crime figure, and you can see who's got the most clout at the meeting, because it's actually the gangster, the alleged gangster, who's saying, you don't want to arrest me, I'll give you back some money, but you won't get anything if you actually arrest me and put me in jail, right? What country does that happen in? I'm sure it's happened before, but still you can see who's the boss at the meeting, right? So this is very discomforting. And now we've got to the point where there's another gangster, Kamchi Kobayev. They detained him too, and he actually is in prison, although apparently he's living pretty well in the prison that he's in. But he's also another one where they're saying, well, look, if we just, maybe we'll just get the money back from him, and that's the best thing. What's the point of actually keeping him in prison when we can get the money back? I'm like, well, the point is actually that there's no penalty to stealing money if you're going to pursue this line of logic. If you're going to say, okay, if you get caught, you have to give back some of the money you stole, but we won't put you in prison. So like I said, it kind of flipped the relationship between government and organized crime, where it seems, or at least you could get the impression that it really is organized crime that's calling the shots now in the country. We all suspected that Japarov, who of course was in prison when the unrest started, had very important sponsors behind him, and everyone kind of looked in the direction of organized criminal groups. But this, the relationship they have with at least these, especially with Matraimov, is at the least level. It's one-to-one. It's not government guy and criminal. It's, they're on the same level when they talk to each other. And there's no hint that the government really wants to pursue these guys or keep them out of politics, even. So I think that's the disquieting thing about what just happened here, and what's going on in the country is that the distinction between the government and organized crime is very blurred all of a sudden. Where at least in the past, it wasn't so obvious as it is at the moment.
And maybe Bruce or Russell or any of them, how did that happen? How did organized crime become so powerful in Kyrgyzstan? I mean, we've seen across the region there are connections between organized crime and senior leaders or government officials. You see that in some neighboring countries. You certainly see that in Russia, but it's all a little bit below the surface. How did it become so prominent, and how did it become almost as if the organized crime groups has greater clout than the governance or the government? So how did that transition happen? Maxim Bakiev, he was the corrupt son of the leader, but now we seem to have more powerful people hanging over the leaders. Any Bruce or Asel or Carl? Or?
Maybe I'll also
Sure.
add in.
Sure, shouldn't.
If no one, so recently, straight after the October 4th or October 5th kind of protests, there was an article in the New York Times that kind of introduced Sadyr Japarov as as a person who's been to prison and he's a convict, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to remember that a lot of Kyrgyz politicians have been imprisoned, and there have been political repressions. And when they find themselves in these prisons, they do have to coexist with criminal elements who are also imprisoned in the same prisons. And therefore, we are by locking up these two groups of people, we are moving them closer together. Also, if before political regimes had, kind of corrupt wives or sons or out of control kind of, spoiled, relatives, now we have a criminal syndicate that starts from China and ends in Europe, and Kyrgyzstan is just is just one of the cogs. So this is a very wide-ranging kind of system, and there are lots of key players, and this symbiosis between the criminals and the politicians. Because we have this, basically, we have a lot of counter political elites, and these conflicts keep happening because it's a very small country, but lots of ambitious people. And recently, we've also had this kind of trend that I've been writing on Twitter about, when the kind of the sycophants of reigning, let's say, presidents, they are without any merit. They're suddenly moved from chauffeur, let's say, to advisor to the president, et cetera, et cetera. But when the president leaves, these people stay, and they want to, keep going up the kind of political ladder and having, and they want to have a political career, and they don't want to go back to being a driver or selling socks at the bazaar or anything like that. So it's a very peculiar situation, and this symbiosis between the criminals. In fact, the politicians use the criminals to harass, like, let's say, people in different towns to make them vote for the political party of, the president or something like that. And in turn, they also get benefits, and maybe the politicians agree to kind of look the other way when they do kind of their misdeeds. And I think this is very kind of it's very lucrative for both groups.
So it seems to be a very symbiotic relationship between both groups. Both benefit, and then we also see how this is merging. It's not just a Kyrgyz problem, if I understand you correctly, but there is also the emergence of transnational organized crime stretching all the way from China to Europe, which is probably also what Carl, when somebody's gunned down in Istanbul or in Turkey, it's tied to all of that. Bruce, Carl, Asel, any other thoughts on that issue? We've got a few other comments. One of them, that came in, which I think is actually kind of important. I mean, for those of us who are in the United States and those of us in the Western Hemisphere, Kyrgyzstan, we can look at it that way, but, we also have the Mexican president who met with the mother of El Chapo after he was convicted in the United States. So it's not just a Kyrgyz issue. There is these broader issues with the intersection of high politics and high levels of organized crime. And we see that right in our neighborhood as well. So I think that's one issue. Bruce, any other further thoughts on that, or Asel or Carl, or?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, Asel, please.
Okay. Just this connection between high politics and the criminal groups have been there in Kyrgyzstan actually since its independence, right? The 90s were really the period when the criminal groups gained not only economic and security authority, but also moral authority. People were turning towards them for personal security, for young people were taking them as a role model. And still today, if you ask children whom they want to become, they say either a deputy, a deputat, or a criminal gangster, right? So we should not take this as a sudden development or kind of an outbreak of criminal groups' activities. Criminal groups have been there in Kyrgyz politics for quite some time, and some leaders of the underground world, like Bayaman, right, who was killed, also whose role and implication in revolutions, or another politician with alleged ties to the criminal world, Baktabasov, who was also taking participation in the attempts to take over power after the April Revolution in 2010. So we tend to forget that those ties and the mergers between politics and criminal groups have been there for quite some time. And I'm not sure, I agree with Bruce that some of this has become really notorious on the surface, and as if politicians and their ties to the criminal world are not trying to hide any longer. But at the same time, I wonder whether this is the fact, or because also the social media, so people tend to learn and know more about this kind of connections and the deals and the scandals due to social media. Today, it's really difficult to hide these kind of things. And another thing is whether this basically today the Kyrgyz politics is becoming more and more networked due to the political parties and the parliamentarization, and therefore involving in those networks not only economic and political ties, but also the criminal networks, in order to advance better their interest and gain more chance to win in the elections.
Okay. Bruce or Carl?
Yeah, I'd just like to touch briefly on what Bruce talked about with the arrest of Rembek Matarimov, and this deal that seems to be in the works where he would just pay 2 billion soms, I think, and then that would be it. And this would be a real shame, I think, for civil society in Kyrgyzstan. First of all, there's Japarov is, the authorities now say that Rembek Matarimov is accused of corruption, but there's been no details whatsoever about the actual charges. So, if this goes through in such an opaque fashion, you would literally have zero accounting to the public about what was committed, when, and speaking of symbiosis between government and organized crime. I mean, the payoff to the budget in order to get out of jail free card, it simply looks like a tribute in a criminal racket. The Russian term is dan, in Russian criminal jargon.
Bruce?
Just a comment on this latest transfer of power, and how did the organized crime appear to become so powerful after this last transfer of power? You know, a strange thought occurred to me right after this happened, and I almost hesitate to compare it, but in areas in the Middle East where state authority broke down, Syria, Libya, Iraq, things like that, there were these groups like the Islamic State who did have a plan, and they were organized, and they go into these places because they know that there is no authority, and there's, you know, just kind of chaos. And you could make some comparisons with what happened, where there was a group that was organized. And after October 5th, there really, you know, the political parties that were participating in the elections and started to meet, who everyone assumed would then go and form a government, really weren't very organized and didn't move very quickly. But somebody else who was at least as organized and moved much more quickly did move in. And that's where you got this, you know, where you ended up with the people that are in power now. Like I said, it was kind of a strange thought that occurred to me, and I hesitate to compare Islamic radical groups to criminal groups in Kyrgyzstan or something, but still it was kind of the same tactic, where there's unrest, people aren't sure what's going to happen tomorrow, everyone's looking for stability, and these guys actually had a plan and were able to move and establish themselves fairly quickly and restore order. I don't think that I would have a hard time believing that this current government's going to last. You know, I see they're setting up elections, but having seen the Kyrgyz people protest again and again, you know, over you know, injustice, biased politics, things like that, I can't believe that they have a long-term future. But certainly, you know, as of October 5th, they were the most organized group, and that's how they moved in, and that's how they got to where they are now.
Mm-hmm.
That your comment just, you know, something I was thinking about. I mean, Kyrgyzstan over the past year, I mean, we've seen the government really fail in meeting the needs of the basic needs of the population. Does that provide organized crime, you know, the poor governance in the country, and sort of the ways you need to get, you know, medicine, and, you know, I think COVID sort of exposed a lot of that. Does that provide organized crime, you know, avenues to cultivate local populations, or you know, do you think sort of the poor governance, how that impacts, like, on a daily level, meeting the needs of the average people?
Well, I mean, certainly the situation in Kyrgyzstan was ripe for this. You know, it wasn't just a question of bad elections. It was, as you mentioned, there was a lot of other things that were going wrong this last year. You know, and really since Jeenbekov got in, and his refusal also to confront it, as we've heard. You know, every time when someone would bring up the subject of Matraimov and his corruption, or rigged, you know, vote buying ahead of elections or something like that, he'd fall back on, show me some facts, you know, again and again. And it was clear that he didn't want to do anything about it. You know, so he kind of he set everything up, helped set everything up for what happened. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
Well, there was a notorious case, right, this summer when Kamchik-Golbayev provided medical equipment and medicine to one of the state hospitals in Isikul area, where he is a native from. And that was all over the media. And the medical staff were thanking Kamchik-Golbayev for providing this help and assistance in the absence of the state official assistance, right? And this was all over the media, and citizens were commenting on this. Some were congratulating Golbayev for filling up the gaps of authority and competence, and many other things. Others were, of course, criticizing the state for failing to provide these basic things and allowing for other criminal groups to fill in the gaps. Yeah, so this was this became really clear under the COVID, and simply a lot of people, and especially in Isikul area. So I'm interviewing a couple of people who've been traveling from Isikul area to participate in the event of the 5th of October. And they were saying that Kamchik-Golbayev was also quite influential during the local elections and the parliamentary elections as well, kind of consulting with local communities and telling them to whom to vote for. So he's still continuing to influence people, even for the presidential elections, also providing them advice on for whom to vote. So it's clearly that the lack of the state, their withdrawal of the state from regions provide a clear infrastructure to be filled up by the other social groups,
Great.
including the criminal ones.
Okay. So we've got a whole bunch of questions that have come in the last few minutes, and some of them is, how are these criminal groups organized? Are they based on locality, ethnic makeup, family, and do they espouse political programs for overt activity, or are they more, there to take advantage of the vacuums that we've seen? So I don't know if Carl, Shirin, or Asel have any thoughts on that.
I would defer to my colleagues in Kyrgyzstan on this question.
Great. Shirin, do you want to take it, or? I think you're muted.
Second.
Good.
Yeah, sounds on. So how are they organized? We have, we have the classic Issyk region, which is, which makes up, I would say, maybe 50% of, the participants of these organized crime groups locally here. But also, mostly it's region-based, but these criminal groups, they, from what I have noticed, they always support any political regime, right? So any president. I haven't, at least for the past 10 years, I haven't seen them supporting, let's say, like the opposition. So, and lately also these criminal groups, I mean, they don't go around just, banging people on the head with sticks and things. They have become business savvy, they want to be accepted within society. As Asel had mentioned, they become benefactors and, share their looted goods, let's say. And people do reach out to them for help. And they do help. But they do get, their own percentage from this. It's a whole system, but this is also like a system that's connected to the larger Russian, kind of the Bratsky Krug system, which originates in Russia. And here it's a little different, but we have a lot of MPs who are linked to criminal groups. And they come to parliament. Nowadays, the requirements to become an MP are very low. Like basically, if you have, I know, from like $200,000, $500,000 US, you can buy yourself, an MP status. And this is what happens. And the more the participation in Kyrgyz politics is for sale, the more criminal elements we get, entering into politics. And then we have this, between these two circles, we have one area where they overlap. And this area is becoming larger and larger. And but I think also these criminal groups, they're quite sophisticated, they build buildings together in Dubai. Criminals from different countries, Central Asian countries. They have, agencies in London through which they open their, huge numbers of these offshore accounts, et cetera, and they're quite modern and sophisticated now.
Thank you. You're talking about sort of neighboring countries. That comes up with another question that we've gotten, specifically talking about Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and what role they have in both strengthening the current government that exists in both good ways and bad ways, but also how they are involved in these criminal networks. Because as I think Asel mentioned, these were transnational in origin, and I think you also did that. So specifically from those two countries, how did they facilitate that?
Well, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan are of course more interesting for for these groups, because those are bigger, larger countries with more money and more possibilities, and Kyrgyzstan just happens to be on the border with China, and this is quite useful for contraband and things like that. But let's take my case. Let's say my husband was illegally arrested after we held 2 protests, one against Matraimov, and one was for freedom of media. And he was illegally arrested at the airport of Almaty without being, officially, without any paperwork that was, prepared between the 2 countries. This was because the Abduqadirs, they have, extreme kind of, they have very high status, and they have good working relations with each of the presidents of Central Asian countries. And they have investments in each country, and, they have become like this, here we have all these like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and then we have the Abduqadirs on top.
Okay. Asel, any other thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's very difficult to really talk about this underground world, right? Because although there is all this social media and everything, but these activities are hidden, and what we can do is just speculate about this. I mean, I think a lot of this new criminal activities arose with the membership, Kyrgyzstan's membership in the Eurasian Union, and sharing the borders with Kazakhstan and then further to Russia. And a lot of also goods being smuggled from Kazakhstan and China to go further down to Tajikistan. So, for example, the smuggling of fuel, right? And that's how this gave rise also to a localized mafia being spread in those transit zones, like, for example, in a small town like Tokmok on the north of Kyrgyzstan, bordering Kazakhstan, or Talas region, also bordering Kazakhstan, or Leylek region, bordering between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. These are the places where local organized crime flourished on the business of smuggling of fuel. So what is interesting is that partly Russia and Kazakhstan condemn Kyrgyzstan for porous borders, for not keeping the borders tight, and for allowing all the smuggles, and basically allowing their that some of the rules of the Eurasian Union fail. But on the other hand, somebody was telling recently on social media that there is nothing that Russia or Kazakhstan didn't comment anything on this transnational scandal involving Matraimov and also involving the Uzbek authorities, for example, right? So Eurasian Union leaders would be in the first place interested in stopping such schemes to flourish from Kyrgyzstan, but we don't see that. So maybe that also tells that Russian and Kazakh criminal groups are also interested in this kind of transnational schemes. And another thing to add, I think today why Matraimov is not really arrested, or we don't see the charges against him, is because his schemes, or we don't know whether he authored these schemes or he's participating as one just simple element of this larger chain. But one thing is clear, that this scheme is very lucrative and very interesting for other actors who would like probably to take his place. And therefore, we don't see the evidence that there is any measure stopping that scheme. Okay, we might remove Raim Matraimov, but not the scheme. And that's interesting. Who will be then buying for it? Who would like them to occupy it?
That's very interesting. That sort of your discussion of the Eurasian Union, it brings up another question that we've seen about that's come in about foreign governments' ability to use organized crime groups, whether it's an intelligence agency, or other groups to try to influence politics. So we certainly see that that organized crime groups in Russia and Kazakhstan are trying to take advantage of that, but do you see avenues for other countries to try to influence what's going on in Kyrgyz politics through these schemes? And Bruce or Carl, please jump in if you have. So you don't see a whole lot of that.
It's just, for me, it's very difficult to really comment on this. I don't want to speculate on this, to be honest.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. So I think maybe we can sort of look forward now. So we have upcoming presidential elections. We have, Japarov certainly in a good stance, seems to be trying to consolidate power. But are there any candidates? Are there anybody who's really talking about real plans to tackle corruption, and do they have any chance of actually being elected? And then, Bruce also talked about sort of the organized crime is filling a vacuum left by sort of unresponsive government. What strategies do you propose to deal with, corruption, organized crime, money laundering, moving forward, and also, preventing, further people either from coming back into power that we might not want to see come back into power. So how do you tackle this issue now? And how does this government moving forward tackle this issue, both with the elections coming up and then if the government isn't able to do it, what can civil society and the international community do? Carl, Bruce, maybe start with you, and then if you have any thoughts on it, and then go to people in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Real briefly with the candidates and who would do it, well, I suppose all of them are going to say they're anti-corruption. It doesn't matter who they are, and they all have some idea of how they're going to root this out. Someone like Bektur Asanov, who was the former governor of Jalalabad, at least was talking about this a couple months ago. So he's on record as having said he's aware of these corruption networks and he would try to do something about it. It's hard to say once he gets in office what exactly would happen. Now, how do you root this stuff out? I'm not sure. I'd like to think there was some way to get it all out. I don't see that that's entirely possible, but there's got to be a way to at least limit its influence in politics somehow or another. And I would suggest that, this frustration that all the young people wanted is probably your best avenue. It's an uphill battle, but you got to bring in a bunch of new people who aren't beholden to other, other figures, other politicians, whatever. I mean, like Shirin had mentioned, it's true that a lot of Kyrgyz politicians have done some jail time. In fact, that's why it was taken out of the constitution that that if you did jail time, you couldn't qualify as a candidate, because there was so many political prisoners that they finally took that out, so that people that got out of jail, like Felix Kulov, Sadyr Japarov, people like that, wouldn't be held against them, because it was unclear whether they were in on for fair reasons or not. But I've always been attracted to that idea that the young people had about let us in, and that was part of their argument, was we're not part of this network. We don't have this baggage that we will drag into parliament with us, which is not to say that organized crime wouldn't be showering them with gifts and trying to get on their good side immediately, but there is some logic to that. I see that. If you were electing some of these people who were in their early 30s, mid 30s or something, at least they haven't developed 20 or 30 years of connections with organized crime.
Carl, SL, or Shirin?
Regarding the corruption, I guess I just might add, if readers would go through and look at the series that we did, starting from the very beginning, almost a year ago.
That series they can find on the RFEROL website.
And at OCCRP and at Kloop.
Yep.
The money that Erkin Saymaty was, the dark money he was pouring out of Kyrgyzstan, out of the Kyrgyz financial system, much of it was ending up in shell firms in the West, in real estate in Europe and in the United States. This was, that money received a nice welcome in the West with apparently little scrutiny. And this was, even the Kyrgyz parliamentary commission that was convened to analyze the circumstances around Saymaty's murder, basically said that he was sending massive sums of money out of the country under the pretext of receiving goods in return, and that he never received the goods in exchange for that money. So tacitly, they're saying what Mr. Saimaiti told our reporters, that he was a professional money launderer. And yet this money was essentially moved into assets and shell firms in the West and in the United Arab Emirates with very little apparent scrutiny, as far as we know, in those countries.
Yeah, I think that highlights there's a huge part that the West can do by shoring up its own self. The real estate section, in particular, in the UAE, in the United States, Europe, London, is notorious. Asel, I see you just turned your mic on, so I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Carl said. It's really important that, I mean, when we talk about Central Asia or in Kyrgyzstan, we tend to think that it's a locked country. Actually, it is not locked, in the sense that it's very much connected to the international finance system. And unless the American or European legislation does not really ban this kind of offshore or tax evasion, or other measures are not really put in place, money will be still laundered and exit from Central Asia and from Kyrgyzstan. So it's really important that the international community there helps Kyrgyzstan to stop this kind of schemes. When it comes to fighting corruption inside the country, there are very classical means to do that, which are working elsewhere, such as independent courts. This is really step number one in fighting corruption, right? The second thing, when we talk about corruption, it's really important to notice that in Kyrgyzstan, it's invaded the state. State has become an investment market, to use Johan Engvall's nice concept that he wrote about Kyrgyzstan in his famous book. So to stop that, the state being basically appropriated by private actors in their private interest. One thing is to develop the economy. It's not, of course, simple, but this way to divert these actors from looking at the state as a source for rents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second, I'm sorry?
I said yes.
Yeah. Second is to increase salaries of state officials, of servants, of teachers, of medics, this way already that the state does not become the attraction to those people who would like to make rents on the state.
Great, thanks. So we have just about a minute left. Maybe I'll turn to Shirin for any final thoughts. One other thing, a quick question I had is, at the beginning of your intervention, you mentioned the new social or new information strategies that you've been working to reach out to Kyrgyz, particularly the youth. I know Bruce spoke about the importance of getting youth involved in politics, and I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about those strategies of getting, what you did to get those people involved and how you might be able to get them involved even more.
Okay, so I wanted to also add on to what Asel was saying. I don't think we, the Kyrgyz, are capable with dealing with this, with what's going on right now independently, and we really do need the assistance of our partners in terms of, I don't know, maybe there are certain motivational kind of ways to get the government of Kyrgyzstan to comply and to start really addressing the issue. But the other topic that I wanted to touch on was the kind of foreign intelligence agencies, whether they have a role in this. They might not have a role, but the fact that China keeps looking away and keeping mum on what's going on the with the smuggling between China and Kyrgyzstan is very demonstrative in that, even though publicly, China condemns corruption and the Uyghur ethnicity is undergoing some hardships in China. somehow we have this Abdulkadir family who are moving around all over the world, these, millions of US dollars left and right. And something is off about the situation, and we really need to do some research and understand what's really going on there and why they're keeping silent.
Okay.
And then on, from mid 2020, we used stenciling, we used stickers, we used merchandise, and this was something new for Kyrgyzstan. We made it kind of hip, let's say, and lots of city kids got involved. And this made it kind of trendy to be politically active. And I'm very happy that, that this caught on because this, this consolidated the young people to work together against corruption.
That's great. I do think, getting youth involved is key, and getting them moving towards a better agenda is key. So I congratulate you on those efforts, and hope that everybody in Kyrgyzstan can do that. We unfortunately have run out of time. We're at a little bit over an hour mark, and we promised we'd end it. I know that several of our guests who are in Kyrgyzstan, it's quite late there, so they need to get on with their evenings. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to pull together and do some more events later at the end of the year. On Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan as well. So we hope to see everybody there. Want to thank our 4 panelists for joining us. Want to thank our audience for joining us. And also like to wish everybody the best of health and the best of safety in these troubling times. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Bruce, Carl, Asel, and Shirin. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.